Middle East questions, returning to the beginning. Should we pivot or not? How important was Kabul? Some would say that there was a significant defeat of American interest by leaving Kabul. The argument to pivot is that, at the end of the day, it's going to be more important to defend Taiwan or Tokyo against an aggressive China. The United States perceives that competition with China. China is competing around the world, but especially in the Eastern Pacific, in the Western Pacific, and the United States is no longer talking about a capacity to fight a two-front war, as was the case in the World War II era. The argument to stay in the Middle East would be could be framed in terms of security and in terms of prosperity. If we're in GPC, great power competition with China, China is dependent on Middle East oil. Why would we give up the Middle East in order to facilitate Chinese penetration? This requires a kind of, it doesn't get to the level of calculus, but it's sort of multiple variable and get beyond the arithmetic of the stovepipe State Department. The Biden administration initiated its foreign policy with the Democracy Summit, which gathered representatives of democracies from around the world. This is a values-driven foreign policy. As it turns out, for the MENA, Middle East, North Africa region, the only countries that were invited were Israel, and Iraq. A stretch, but okay. Elections, but no one else. I'm not going to argue that those other countries are democracies, but I would argue that a foreign policy that prioritizes meeting democratic qualifications and excludes pretty much everyone from the region is probably an insufficient foreign policy for that region. Maybe there are other ways to engage that region, but maximizing the importance of values agreement with what is understood to be the United States position is probably not effective. Israel and the region, Scott referenced the achievement of the Trump administration in terms of the Abraham Accords, which you're all familiar with, but it basically shifted the paradigm from Israel having first to figure out the Palestinians and then move outward across the region, that's inside out to outside in, reaching out to countries further away from Israel-Palestine, trying to find some accommodation with them, and then maybe moving closer toward some kind of resolution of the plight of the Palestinians. Again, happy to talk more about that in detail. And what we see in this era of great power competition, whether we talk about peers or near peers, the point is that the illusion of a unipolar world that prevailed in the giddy years of the 1990s is gone. The United States may not like some countries, but those countries can go to our peers, our near peers, and try to cut deals there. When Washington was laying on into Mohammed bin Salman, the first thing he did was get on a plane to Beijing. That was a message. I think a strong relationship between Washington and Riyadh is in American national interest, in terms of security, in terms of economy, and it's the only way to have leverage on democratic values there. But if we rebuff a country that has the capacity to hedge, we are effectively giving our adversaries an opening. Now, the hedging question is currently particularly interesting with Turkey. When I was in Ankara in the spring, speaking with the foreign minister and the vice president, there was this window of almost normalization between Turkey and the United States and even Europe because of the role that Turkey is playing in the Ukraine war. It was Turkish drones that were pushing back on the Russians first. And if we're in a competition with Russia, take that as an assumption, Turkey is as well on multiple fronts, in Libya, in Nagorno-Karabakh, in Ukraine, and in Syria. But just this past week, or 10 days ago, the foreign minister of Turkey talked about opening discussions with Damascus, with Assad, and the Syrian Arabs in northern Syria, in the areas not controlled by the regime, came out in masses protesting that. I think that the United States lost an opportunity to build on that normalization moment. What Turkey is doing is hedging. What Turkey is doing is trying to play Washington against Moscow and Tehran in particular. Complex, difficult, but something that one has to pay attention to. As I said, I think those of you who are interested in foreign policy should think about working in the State Department. Foreign Service officer's career is a good one. If you're prepared to have the rhythm of life of 3 years in Washington, 3 years somewhere else, coming back to Washington, going overseas, it can be adventurous. Many people thrive on this. For some people, it's not the right thing to do. You have to take the Foreign Service officer's examination and get admitted. The United States State Department, unlike most other foreign services, gives you extraordinary language training when you go overseas. I think only the French do this now, or maybe the British, but most other countries don't equip their diplomats with language skills. So it's a real opportunity to learn and to grow and serve the country. There are other ways to do foreign policy. You can become IR specialists and work in universities. You can work in think tanks. You can go into journalism. But I want to say that my time in the State Department was a very special time when you're working on the objective issues. It's not just spouting positions. It's really contributing to the pursuit of the national interest in the foreign policy domain. That's what I have to say to you, and I'm happy to entertain some questions. And I've been advised that the TA should call on the questioners.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
My name is Dan.
Stand up.
Yeah, sure. Wait. My name is Dan. I'm from Israel. Do you think that the withdrawal from Afghanistan and perhaps the inactivity of American military on the soil of Ukraine maybe have damaged the United States' reputation in terms of a reliable superpower in the region? I mean, we see now the Gulf countries that signed the Abraham Accords flirting with Iran. What do you think of that? Thank you.
So, I didn't hear the first one. The withdrawal from Afghanistan and
Ukraine in terms of like not being active on the soil of Ukraine. I mean, in general, should allies of the United States in the Middle East should be concerned?
The United States should be able to assure its allies that it has their back. Because of ambiguity in examples of U.S. foreign policy, and because of the objective condition of a multipolar world, countries look around and try to hedge their bets. If I were working in the foreign policy establishment of an American ally, as you suggest, I would probably recognize the United States as the first go-to ally. It's the most powerful country, and depending on which country we're talking about, one with a long history of support. Nonetheless, it would be foolish for someone in another foreign policy establishment not to play out other scenarios, play out other games. I think was this caused by the withdrawal from Afghanistan? Clearly, the mismanagement of the withdrawal from Afghanistan damaged U.S. credibility. There's no doubt about that. Longer discussion about Afghanistan policy. We still await a full hearing on the withdrawal and on Afghanistan policy. In a sense, there has been no accountability so far. A lot of people made decisions which were apparently bad. And it's stunning that there aren't congressional hearings about this. The question of Ukraine is different. In my view, the Russians and the Americans and the Europeans were all in agreement that Ukraine was going to fold overnight. The Russians were going to walk into Kiev like they did into Prague in 1968. And the real story here is that the Ukrainians were in fact able to fight back and fight back significantly even before there was Western support for them. I think that's a testimony to a kind of national populism in Ukraine. They don't want to go under Russian occupation, and they're prepared to die for that. And unless you're prepared to die, you're going to be occupied. As they fought back, this impressed the Western publics. And the Western publics pushed their reluctant politicians to start to support Ukraine. I think along the way, on the political level, there have been calculations about how much we're going to support Ukraine. Are we going to support Ukraine to be able to fight to a draw? Or are we going to support Ukraine to a point of being able to defeat Russia? I think that is unresolved right now. I don't see U.S. behavior in Ukraine as evidence that would support doubts among allies. I do see the behavior in Afghanistan as evidence that would support those doubts.
Hello there. Thanks for joining us today.
Sure.
So I remember you mentioned earlier you expressed your support for the United States' alliance with Saudi Arabia and our strategic relationship with them. I was wondering if you might be able to speak a little bit more as far as why you would argue that the benefits to that relationship outweigh its downsides, its consequences. And I say that specifically in light of the fact that this country is an Islamic dictatorship, and as far as I understand it, insofar as America has an alliance with them, it's led to situations in which, well, U.S. presidents and diplomats have sort of had to suck up to their system of politics, and I think that in many ways that could make the U.S. and the appearance of the U.S. on the global stage appear weak, and let alone the fact that, you know, through an alliance, the U.S. is committed to defending them as a nation, but I'm not sure that U.S. citizens on average would really be willing to get behind that commitment.
Okay, on your last point, will U.S. citizens get behind something? This is about the obligation of political leadership to try to make policies make sense to the electorate. This holds for all policies. Let me leave that question aside, because the core of your question is about the value of the U.S.-Saudi relationship, which goes back to Roosevelt. Believe it or not, the world economy needs energy sources, and Saudi remains a significant producer of oil. Particularly at a moment in which the United States seems to be prepared to cut back its own domestic production, foreign production of oil, in particular Saudi, gains significance. That's, you know, the real world. You know, if we could all overnight just stop driving and turn off all our lights, maybe this calculation would be different. Assuming that's not going to happen here or anywhere, at least it won't happen anywhere by design. It may happen by default. sources of energy are important. There's an argument to be made that we should be building out solar, et cetera, but we're nowhere near meeting current demands. And in particular, if we want to stop reliance on Russian oil, especially Russian oil and gas, especially in Europe, the Saudi source becomes more important. Now, okay, that's one dimension of this. Islamic dictatorship. I think it's being Islamic doesn't make it worse. It's a dictatorship. The United States has a history of collaborating with dictatorships during the Cold War because of the perception that the competition with communist Russia was more important, and therefore put up with alliances with dictatorships in East Asia, in South Korea, in Taiwan, in Latin America. The world is not such that one can restrict one's friends to those with whom one agrees. That may be the model on a college campus, but it's not the model in a world where there's a real competition for resources and power. Sometimes you have to deal with people you don't like. Now the case with Saudi Arabia was particularly acute. I'm sure you all know this because of the vile murder of Jamal Khashoggi, the Saudi-origin journalist who wrote for the Washington Post. And people were rightly disgusted with that. President Trump condemned it. The question is, does that mean we will have no relationship with Riyadh henceforth? If that's the regime in Tehran also assassinates journalists, and I could go through a list of those. But at the same time, we're carrying on the JCPOA negotiations in a particularly humiliating way with them. So it's okay if Iran assassinates journalists, and it's not okay if Riyadh does. This is the question of balancing values against interests. If you want to be a purist, but then stop driving. The additional point on the specifics of Riyadh, a dictatorship, a monarchy is I think the correct term, and the presumptive heir to the monarchy has been rash, has been brutal, has been powerful, and has carried out some reforms that are breathtaking. Reforms of that magnitude don't take place by consensus. He's an absolute monarch in the style of the 18th century, and these are tough guys too. He has undermined the power of a religious establishment, so in a sense made the country less Islamic. He's extended rights to women who are of course not equal, but they are much more empowered than they were before. And he has broken up the power of the de facto aristocracy, this enormous network of relatives of the royals that he basically expropriated. That's all revolutionary. That's all French revolutionary. So I think that if one is interested in seeing an expansion of values, one has to ask, how is that going to happen if not this way?